Do you have a cell phone?
Yes.
Okay. I have one too. Every month we pay the bill. Every time we pay the bill, we become more vested psychologically in that product, so that when you're vested, and you're vested repeatedly, when someone comes to you and says, this is dangerous, and you're using a phone that's dangerous, because you're vested, you have a psychological resistance to hear it. And that's where most of the skepticism comes from.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 129, and my guest today is Dr. George Carlo. George is a world-recognized medical scientist and tech expert. He is an epidemiologist and a public health scientist, the chairman of the Wireless Technology Research Group in the 1990s, and he is currently the chairman of the Nonprofit Science and Public Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. George is a level-headed, knowledgeable man who is not an alarmist, and yet today he does sound some alarm bells to wake us up to the dangers that radiation poses to our health. Specifically, the radiation that is emitted from our cell phones, tablets, and Wi-Fi networks. He gives us some history on how we got where we are today, how the radiation affects us on a cellular level, no pun intended, and what we can do to best protect ourselves from its effects. Before we get into it, we want to recognize our sponsors. The Wise Traditions Podcast is supported in part by the Frenching Your Foods Telesummit. Learn the core secrets of the French on how to stay slim, healthy, and happy. And the summit is free and going on now. Go to frenching.nutritionheretic.com to listen to 15 experts, including me. And Defender Shield, the trusted worldwide leader in EMF protection and safety. Protect yourself and your family from EMF radiation. Visit defendershield.com. Welcome to Wise Traditions, George.
Nice to be here. Appreciate it.
So you have been at the forefront of this movement of making people aware of the dangers of radiation. As a matter of fact, I understand that you wrote a letter to industry heads, making clear to them how the dangers were very present, and yet I don't think you were that well received. Tell us the story of that letter.
Well, how that came about. That was in 1999. Prior to that, go back about 6 years, the issue about cell phones and cell phones coming into commerce was one that was fraught with, I would say, neglect from the outset. Originally, cell phone technology was developed in the military. And in 1984, it was decided that it could become a consumer product. But because so much work had been done prior in the military, as well as looking at microwave radiation effects, such as those that occur from microwave oven use, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The feeling was that cell phones, because they were of such low power, would not carry health effects, and therefore they were not tested for safety before they came into the marketplace.
The key is that word feeling. You said that was the feeling, but there had been no testing done.
There had been no testing, so no pre-market testing, as would normally be required for a radiation-emitting device like a cell phone. So 1984, cell phones come into use, and in the early part of 1992, questions began to be raised about brain tumors coming from people who use cell phones. What happened, interestingly, is there was a woman who had a brain tumor, and her husband worked in the early stages of the wireless industry. He sold wireless devices down in Florida, cell phones and walkie-talkies and those types of things. She was having a difficult pregnancy, and he bought her a cell phone so that she could talk to him while he was working, while she was laying in bed during this pregnancy. She developed a brain tumor, and her doctor, a guy by the name of Dr. David Perlmutter, who has gone on to be famous about some other things that he's done in his career. David took an X-ray and saw that the pattern of the tumor was very similar in location to where she used the cell phone. With that information, they sued the manufacturer of the cell phone because of her having contracted this brain tumor. And when the lawsuit became public, he went on Larry King Live, Dr. Perlmutter did, and showed the X-ray and put a phone next to the place on the X-ray where the cell phone was. So now you had the Larry King Live show with all of its viewership having this alarm bell sounded.
I remember hearing about this trial and this suit. So what happened?
The next day, Motorola and other wireless stocks began to go down. So the industry responded by saying that cell phones were absolutely safe. There were thousands of studies proving that they were safe, and there was nothing to worry about. And it turned out that there were no studies. And the studies that were done were on microwave ovens, so that the industry was called before Congress. At the time, Congressman Markey, who's now Senator Markey from Massachusetts, was the chairman of the committee that had oversight of these wireless devices. And through the process of the hearing, it became clear that the industry had, number one, not done appropriate testing. The FDA did not require them to do appropriate testing, and that the industry had not been totally forthright about their basis for assuming that cell phones were safe. What ended up happening was the Industry Trade Association stepped up and said, we will put what became $28.5 million into a fund to do the research that should have been done in 1984. And that's the program that I ran. They brought me in. The WTR was called.
Wireless Technology Research.
Right.
Okay, so here you are. You've got money from the industry. You've been tasked with doing some studies and finding out what the effects are of the cell phone radiation. What did you find out?
The first thing was the context is important to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Studies that are done pre-market, in other words, before a device or a drug or a chemical come on the market, those studies are aimed at finding problems so that if you find a problem in a study pre-market, you can make changes to the technology so that when it does come out into the marketplace, it's safe. So that the orientation of those types of studies is different. But we had a different situation here because these cell phones were already in use and there had been no pre-market testing. So we had to develop a new way of looking at the science post-market to give us inferences that were reasonable for the fact that now there were, at the time, 15 million people using cell phones. Because the industry was paying for the studies, we had to be very careful to make sure that it didn't look like the industry bought the results. Mm-hmm. So we had the Harvard School of Public Health doing peer review for us. We publicized our research agenda. So over a period of years, it was very much an open process. And the letter that you referred to was part of business as usual because our arrangement was that we would conduct this work independently of the industry. They would put the money up, but we would do it independently. And when we had findings, we would notify them in terms of what they should do and what we found. So this letter in 1999 was business as usual in one context because we were reporting back to the industry that we had found evidence of genetic damage in human blood cells based on exposure to the cell phone radiation. And we had an increase in the risk of rare type of brain tumor, similar to what Susan Reynard, the woman in 1992, had contracted, and that our recommendation was that there should be warnings put out to people who are using cell phones. Now, in 1993, there were 15 million people using cell phones. By the time we got to 1999, there were 100 million.
Wow.
Now we're worldwide about 6 or 7 billion people using cell phones. When we came out with these findings and this recommendation, the industry was not prepared because they really thought they had a public relations problem, not a public health problem.
Interesting. They felt caught off guard. They were surprised by the results, didn't expect it. And then they thought, well, we have to make this look better in the eyes of the public. They weren't thinking about the damage it was doing to people's health. That really surprises me.
Back to the way we had to design the scientific research. We had to do things that had not really been done before in terms of rationales for interpretation of certain types of experiments and whatever. We had to develop, for example, an exposure system for both in vitro, which are test tube studies, and in vivo, which are animal studies. We had to develop an exposure system that approximated what would happen if a person put a cell phone up to their head. If you would put a cell phone up to the head of a rodent, for example, and use the same power that you would be using with a regular cell phone, you would pretty much disintegrate the brain of the rodent.
Wow.
Because the rodent is so much smaller than human. So new things had to be developed, and because the systems of study were new, there was not the normal validation or replication that you would normally see with scientific studies. So you could look at the results of the work that we did in the WTR and come to two different conclusions about whether or not this was an imminent public health risk or not, The reason was because we didn't have a lot of data that was corroborative or supportive. So when we made the recommendation to the industry, it was in the context of we've done the best studies that could be done anywhere in the world, and that's true. We spent $28.5 million on this work. It's the best data we have, and based on this information, it makes sense to be precautionary. We don't know how this is going to play out over time, but it makes sense to warn the public. In the ensuing 15 to 18 years, everything that we had found in that program in the 90s has now been corroborated all around the world, so that we do know that we have serious dangers. We do know that people need to take precautionary steps on their own. And I think that the industry, ironically, has been between a rock and a hard place a little bit, because in 1999, after we came out with these findings, of course, they were quite shocking. News media took to writing about it. There were exposés done on ABC News 2020 and others. The industry, to protect themselves, attacked the messenger. So they came after...
A common tactic.
A common tactic. So they came after us. And I had 200 scientists and doctors working with me on that program. This was not just me. Right. So it was a big program. The industry came after the messenger. And in order to protect not only myself, but also those who had spent years working on this program, we came out with a book. I wrote this book with a co-author named Martin Schramm, who is a syndicated columnist here in D.C. The book was called Cell Phones, Invisible Hazards in the Wireless Age. The book really laid out the clash of science and politics and business. Mm-hmm. And following that book, there were a number of lawsuits brought against the industry. And because those lawsuits were brought, the industry was sort of stuck with not saying anything more, because what they would be saying would work against them in the litigation. Now, interestingly, those lawsuits went up to the Supreme Court in 2005. They were remanded back to the states. There's a sort of complicated legal history, and they are now active in D.C. Superior Court here. And the expectation is that sometime during 2018, there will be some resolution to these lawsuits.
I want to get back to a phrase you said a moment ago. You said, at the time, it didn't seem necessarily like it was an imminent public health concern. Do you see it that way now, George?
Absolutely now. But even then, we knew that genetic damage in human blood, had that finding occurred pre-market, cell phones never would have made it into the consumer marketplace without being different. Mm-hmm. The same thing with the finding of the increased risk of rare neuroepithelial tumors of the brain. The evidence, if you will, at the time said this doesn't look good. This is a potential problem. And now that has been validated by others around the world.
And yet, I don't feel like that word is getting out. When I talk to people about the hazards or the dangers of radiation from our cell phones, I get kind of raised eyebrows and skepticism in return. What should I point to? What are some of the things that have convinced you more and more that this is really a true health hazard?
The science. It's not like there's one or two studies. We're talking about thousands of studies now that have been done showing that what we call the information-carrying radio waves that come from cell phones, it's not only cell phones, it's Wi-Fi, it's other forms of wireless communication. Those information-carrying radio waves are what we call, they're polarized waves. Meaning that they're able to trigger protective responses in our individual cells. And when those protective responses are triggered, what happens is that the cells shut down. Their functionality becomes compromised. Cells are not able to communicate with each other. Therefore, you have tissue issues. When tissues can't communicate with each other, you have organ issues. When organs can't communicate with each other, you have organ system issues. And when there are organ system issues, the organism or the human being is compromised. This is a mechanism that is operating. So that is the strongest evidence, is that it isn't just that we've observed that people who use cell phones have higher rates of certain types of tumors. It's that there is a mechanism that we now understand is operating that lends biological plausibility to the observation. Now, if we were in a situation with a pharmaceutical drug or a chemical or a pesticide, and you had the same evidence, those products would not be able to go onto the market. So that we're in a situation where, the horse came out of the barn. Mm-hmm. We now have 300 million people in the United States and 6 or 7 billion worldwide using wireless technology of all sorts every day. And we're trying to figure out how can we now put the genie back in the bottle in terms of public health risk. And there's one other aspect that I want to mention. Do you have a cell phone?
Yes.
Okay. I have one too. Every month we pay the bill. Every time we pay the bill, we become more vested psychologically in that product. So that when you're vested, and you're vested repeatedly, when someone comes to you and says, this is dangerous, and you're using a phone that's dangerous, because you're vested, you have a psychological resistance to hear it. And that's where most of the skepticism comes from. So we're in a very difficult spot because the science is clear. We need to take precautions, and there are precautions that we can take, but the resistance comes from denial. And the denial comes from the fact that we're vested. We're making this choice every day for ourselves and for our kids, for those around us.
We kind of don't want to hear it, which is one reason I'm glad that you've come out with this movie. You were participating in this movie called Generation Zapped, and that is to help pierce our veil of denial, if you will, right? Tell us a little bit about that movie and how you got involved in Generation Zapped.
The film is made by Sabine El-Jamal, wonderful woman, and she became interested in this because she has some young children, and she had heard about concerns about Wi-Fi in schools, which is another form of wireless communication. And she began looking into this as a mom. And as she went forward and learned more, she found that, well, there's a lot out there. There's a lot of science. When she began to see that it's not like 5 or 6 scientists, it's like 500 or 600 scientists. Her thinking was, well, they can't all be wrong. So she began to look into this deeper. And I think that when they came to me, they asked if I would do an interview for the film. I agreed to do an interview. And during the course of the interview, as we started talking about this, I think that Sabine said, wow, there's a history here. This goes all the way back into the 1940s and 50s and 60s, that we've been dealing with wireless communication and understanding that there are biological effects for decades. And I think that it triggered in her, why hasn't someone done something about this? Why am I just hearing about this now? Because I'm concerned about my children.
Coming up, George gives us practical tips on how we can protect ourselves from harmful radiation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors, the Frenching Your Foods Telesummit. Do you struggle with health concerns, losing weight, or staying fit? Then perhaps the French can teach us a lesson. They eat whatever they want, they don't bother with gym memberships, and they stay healthy and fit without effort. The Frenching Your Foods Telesummit is going on right now through April 27th. Listen to 15 experts, including yours truly, doctors, nutritionists, and more, who expose the core secrets the French know to keeping skinny, healthy, and happy. All without expensive diets, going to the gym, or limiting what they eat. So go to frenching.nutritionheretic.com to listen in for free. And Defender Shield. Defender Shield is the worldwide leader in mobile radiation shielding. Independently tested by FCC certified labs, Defender Shield is the first technology to block up to virtually 100% of electromagnetic radiation frequencies from laptops, tablets, and cell phones, making it the most effective EMF radiation shielding for mobile devices ever developed. For more information, go to defendershield.com and use the coupon code WISETraditions10 for a 10% discount at checkout. Now, one thing I liked about your movie is that it gave ideas for how to take responsibility, as you said, responsibility ourselves to lower our exposure. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of those steps we can take, George?
First thing is that we don't want the radiation emitting device, the cell phone, close to our bodies. So that if you're going to use a cell phone, the important thing is to keep it at least a foot or two away from you. In order to do that, you either use the speakerphone or use a wired headset, for example. So that those are the things that you can do in terms of while you're talking on the phone. It isn't a good idea for men to put it in their pockets because close to private parts. It's a real bad idea for women to put it in their bras, while they're running or jogging or whatever. The first thing is distance is helpful. Because the closer the phone is to your body, the greater the penetration is the radiation plume into your tissues. So distance is the first thing. Second thing that's important is to realize that if you're not using the phone, for example, at night, turn it off so that you don't have the pinging, because the phone is always communicating with the infrastructure of base stations that are in the environment where you are. So that in order for someone who might want to call you, for the phone to know where you are, for the system to know where you are, they have to constantly be pinging back and forth. When the phone is pinging back and forth, it's emitting a plume of biologically active radiation. I should clarify that we're talking here about what's called non-ionizing radiation.
Uh-huh.
It's not the same as radiation you would get from an X-ray, which is ionizing radiation. So this non-ionizing radiation is very subtle. It sits in the background, and it triggers biological responses because our body is trying to protect us from it.
I kind of picture it like, do you remember when Manuel Noriega, they were trying to get him out of power in Nicaragua? And I think they were like blasting loud rock music at him to like annoy him. I picture it like that's what's happening. We're getting these signals. Of course, we can't actually perceive them with our ears, but these signals are making our cells have trouble communicating, and they're alarming our whole body.
What happens, and this, using noise as crowd control, and there are armies around the world, including ours, who have used sound microwaves for crowd control as well. It creates chaos within your body. And when there's chaos, your sympathetic or survival nervous system takes over, and you're not able to think, and you're not able to be rational.
This is alarming because some of us live in apartments where we're surrounded by Wi-Fi networks, not just one or two. I'm talking like 25, 30. Mm-hmm. What can we do in that scenario?
That's a tough one, because I think you'll remember in the film, my good friend Ulla Johansson from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden has a quote in there that if you ask how much more background radiation is there today than, say, 10 years ago, and he says, is it 2 times as much? Is it 3 times as much? He said, no. It's a quintillion times as much. He said that's a 1 with 18 zeros. What that means is that we're being bathed in these wireless signals now to an unprecedented level. Now, can we run away from it? No. So what do we do? Where are we? Well, the first thing that we have to keep in mind is that whenever there is an environmental change, whether it's electricity, wireless signals, differences in background sun radiation, anything having to do with the environment. Our bodies are always in a race between damage and compensation. The way we adapt is because there's been an insult, and then we're able to compensate for that. When the damage is greater than the compensation, you have illness. But when the compensation is greater than the damage, you have adaptation. While we can minimize exposure by turning off our cell phones and turning off Wi-Fi at night if we're not going to use it, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we increase our own adaptive capacity so that our compensation capacity is greater than the damage. We're going to have to do that. Otherwise, we will not be able to evolve in the environment that we have created.
Beautiful. Well, I think our listeners will understand this because we are constantly addressing this. We want people to strengthen their bodies through diet and lifestyle changes so that we can handle whatever life throws at us.
Exactly. It seems that we have a more urgent need now for that. So it isn't just a matter of looking good, losing weight, or whatever. We need to be able to increase our adaptive capacity in order for us to survive in the environment that we have created. We have to keep in mind that wireless technology just didn't happen just because the industry thought it would be nice for us to force this technology on the population. That's not what happened. What happened was people said, it's pretty cool to have a cell phone. It's pretty cool to have 3 cell phones, and I can run my business from the cell phone, and I won't need to pay rent for an office anymore. So what happened was that there was a demand, there was a consumer demand, and to a large degree, the industry has been responding to the consumer demand. So we really have a little bit of responsibility to bear. It isn't just big bad industry forcing something upon the population. It's not all that. This adaptation and healthy living is key.
Absolutely. Though I do want to ask about big bad industry, because when we talk about 5G, this new stronger network that they want to put all around our neighborhoods by putting devices on our lampposts and stuff, that feels like industry pushing something on us. Can you speak to that a little bit, George?
It's complicated. There's no easy answer. And in order to look at this from a historical point of view, let me go back to the 1970s when we laid the transatlantic cable. that connected the United States with the European continent for phone calls. It was great because now we could talk on our phones to people in Italy, where my family came from, without delay. Very, very cool. And when that happened, we made a decision in terms of the United States government to have an infrastructure that was based on fiber optics. So we began laying fiber all across the country. And an easy place to lay fiber was underneath railroad tracks because there were rights of way. So we began laying fiber optic cable in the 70s and 80s all through the country. The idea was that the communication infrastructure was going to be based on fiber. Now, in the early 90s, when the first cell phones came into use, the idea was to carry a signal wirelessly for a little ways and then connect into landline phones. Eventually, the landline phones would connect into fiber. They would be buried underground, and that's what we would have. When the popularity of cell phones exploded, it became clear that it was cheaper to build towers and have the infrastructure itself be wireless instead of wired so that the industry could expand the use of cell phones more rapidly so that the infrastructure became wireless. And those are the towers that we have now. You know, it's interesting. There's a website called Antenna Search.
Antenna Search.
Antenna Search. If you go to antennasearch.com and you put in your address, it will show you how many towers there are within a mile or two of your home and also how many antennas are on those towers so that you can get an idea of what your background radiation might be based on the load of the infrastructure. It's not 2 or 3 towers and it's not 5 or 6 antennas. It's hundreds around everybody's home. You know, the question that you raised about the Wi-Fi in your apartments.
Yeah.
Well, when you expand the environment to your neighborhood, you have multiples. So what ends up happening is the wireless infrastructure becomes a predominant infrastructure, hundreds of thousands of towers now across the country. And that's how we do cell phones. Now, the 5G that you mentioned is a different kind of signaling. It has higher frequencies, but higher frequencies are interfered with more by what's in the environment. They can't travel as far. So that in order for 5G to be distributed, those 5G signal carriers have got to be connected by fiber. So that 90% of the 5G infrastructure, even though it's coming down to the street, requires fiber optic connecting. And then it's a wireless signal to your phone, a wireless signal to your home. So even though the idea of 5G is one that people are concerned about because we're talking about these transmitters being put on fake mailboxes, you know, and light posts near your house and all of that, we don't really know what the true added risk is going to be. We simply don't know. When I look at this and I step back and say, how are we going to fix this damn thing? This is a big problem. We have to fix it. How are we going to do it? One of the solutions is fiber. If we had a fiber optic infrastructure, then we don't have the high levels of background wireless. We don't have the quintillion. I look at 5G sort of with two sides of the coin. One side of the coin is this is a high-frequency signal that's going to penetrate deeper into the body, but it won't go as far. There could be some functionally equivalent effects similar to what we have with cell phones. We don't know that, but we think logically there's something there. The other side of the coin is if these people are building 90% fiber optic infrastructure to make 5G happen, well, then if all things were equal, this would be a step in the direction of a wired infrastructure where we would want to go.
Exactly.
So it's complicated. I'm of a mind that I think that with 5G, we have to hold off. We have to wait. Let's study this darn thing. Let's figure out if there's a way for us to get to a better place with this technological innovation. In order for that to happen, it requires a reason to do it by the industry. And I think that now, if you look around the country, there are all sorts of people who are activists and they're protesting 5G and they're going into state legislatures and local community governments and saying, hold off, hold off. That's the best thing we can do. Those folks are really helping. Now, at the end of the day, if we can delay and we can study what the biological impacts are going to be and see if there's a way to use a better infrastructure to help eliminate some of the background radiation, I think we'll be in a better place.
Well, you've given us some concrete tips on how to reduce our own personal exposure and take responsibility. And then as a group, how we can get involved. We will make sure to put links in our show notes to some of these groups that you've mentioned, articles that we can refer people to when they want to learn more about this. I have just two more questions as we prepare to close up, George. What was the result of the trial of the woman who had the brain tumor? Susan Reynard, was it?
Unfortunately, after she gave her deposition, she passed away. The lawsuit went forward and then it was dropped. And the reason that it was dropped was because it was dismissed from the court because there were not studies that were directly relevant to cell phone radiation.
And we're in a different place with that today, aren't we?
We're in a different place.
So I want to ask you the question I often pose to my guests. If the listener could do one thing to improve their health, particularly in relation to the radiation we've been discussing today, what would you recommend that they do?
Two things.
Okay.
Two things. First is minimize your exposure. In other words, use a headset. Move the phone away from you. If you're not using the phone, turn it off. Same thing with Wi-Fi. If you're not using it, turn it off. So that by minimizing exposure, you minimize the insult to your body. That's the first thing. The second thing is be healthy. Do all you can to exercise, proper diet, make sure you get sleep. All of those things that are healthy living tips that now are going to be necessary for us to adapt.
Fantastic advice, George. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
My guest today was Dr. George Carlo. For more on this subject, go to adaptationproject.org. It is a group that George is associated with. For the show notes and highlights from this episode with links to resources we mentioned, just go to our website and find the show notes for episode 129. Hey, and if you are enjoying these episodes, go ahead and subscribe through Apple Podcasts so you don't miss a thing. And rate and review us also. That helps people know that the show is worth listening to. And don't forget you can share episodes on social media. Speaking of which, go ahead and follow us on Twitter at Weston A. Price and Instagram at Weston A. Price. And look for us on Facebook, the Weston A. Price Foundation. We want to stay connected with you. Next week, everybody, we will hear from Dr. Anthony J. on the topic of soy. There is a lot of confusion on this topic. Some people call soy heart healthy. Others consider it a go-to meat substitute. Dr. J sheds new light on soy and explains how soy can mess with our health and hormone balance. So listen in to next week's show. Finally, a big thank you to my friends at Podcast Village, Rob Ford, Charlie Burney, and Oscar and the team. We also have a bunch of interns who are helping us pull off the show week after week. Cynthia Castro, Cohen Enriquez, Joy de los Santos, Amy Marvin, Lily Hemft, Deirdre Beard, Melanie Ahern, Mary Hine, and Olga de Villiers. Thank you to all of you. And don't forget, everybody, I'm Holistic Hilda. You can find me on Twitter at Holistic Hilda, on Instagram at Holistic_Hilda, and there's my website, holistichilda.com, for health and podcast tips. I've learned a lot on my journey, and I want to help you on yours. Thanks, everybody, and keep on listening.
Did you know that there are Weston A. Price Foundation chapters all over the U.S. and around the world? Chapter leaders help you find good food in your area, and some have meetings you can attend. Go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on Find a Local Chapter to see if there is one near you. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.